Hello and welcome to the Brewster Call podcast, where ad hominem is dead and liberty lives. I'm your host, Jason, and today is a historical occasion because we have our first ever guest person. This is Dr. Will Moravits. Could you please introduce yourself?
My name is Will Moravits. I born and raised in Texas, and I had a lot of different jobs over my life, but I most recently I'm a college professor of political science. I worked at St. Phillips College for a little over a year before they terminated me for some pro-police and conservative views that were presented in class. But I'm currently an adjunct at Texas State University, and I'm a former police officer.
Well, thank you for your service, first off. That's very interesting to hear. I'm assuming St. Phillips is in Texas. Usually you'd expect the sort of censorship and firing from jobs to be more of a thing you'd see up here in Massachusetts. So tell me about that.
Well, it's interesting because, I've been in politics, studying politics now for, I guess, on my own. I didn't get my undergrad in political science, but I started really getting involved in politics after the 2000 election, which was my senior year of college. And then got my master's and then my PhD in that arena. I'm familiar with people getting canceled and this kind of anti-conservative atmosphere that exists in a lot of colleges. It wasn't something that I experienced as an undergrad, going to college at Texas A&M in the 90s. Although, looking back, I guess there was some kind of hints of it here and there from certain people in the faculty, but it was never this overt kind of like you couldn't speak up, on campus, especially at A&M where the student body is pretty conservative. And then having it happen to me was very surreal. Texas has a reputation of being a very red state, although it's not quite as red as people may think. But at the college level, administration is just not that way. And, St. Phillips, while it started off as a private institution, has been part of the Alamo Community College's public district now for, probably close to 80 years. It just kept the name St. Phillips. So it is a public institution. So you would assume that you would have some modicum of free speech and what have you. But it was a very DEI focused institution, very much with anti-racism book clubs. And, one of the things that struck me my very first week there as a full-time employee, the convocation speaker, which was not an employee, or it was a guest from outside the institution, but it was a speaker who talked about diversity and then made it very clear that she was not talking about diversity of thought. And in fact, she stated that people who claim that they want diversity of thought are actually just racists who don't want to talk about race, and they're kind of hiding behind that. And so that was kind of my first inclination that, kind of need to be careful here. And, fortunately for me, I had some colleagues in my department who were like-minded. And so we kind of banded together, but it wasn't too long into my tenure there as a full-time employee that I kind of had a target put on my back, and that came from the publication of my book last year that came out in February. So, or I guess, it's 2024. So almost 2 years ago now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So time flies when you get old like me. So
I've started to experience that as well. So tell me about that book and why it could be controversial to them, at least.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I was a former police officer, and when I left the industry, the field, and went into academia, I've always kind of tried to explain to students when we talk about the criminal justice amendments to the Bill of Rights, right? The 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th amendments, kind of explain to them what those amendments do and how they actually apply in practice, for college students. Because, as a cop, I worked in San Marcos, Texas, where Texas State is, where I now teach. And I can remember, college students, they take, 2 months of a intro to criminal justice class, and they think they know everything. and they would tell us, oh, well, I know my rights, whatever. And so I try to explain this to students. Okay, here's actually what your rights are, and we're going to do some role playing. I'm going to give you some examples, real life examples, scenarios, and I'm going to explain to you so that you actually know how they apply and why they apply the way they do. And I went through use of force with them a lot, and I would talk about some of these high profile cases that you hear in the media, like probably starting back in 2014 with Eric Garner and then Michael Brown. And the books that we use often make statements, the more recent editions, anyways, make statements like blacks are disproportionately killed by police and they experience higher levels of deadly force and, this kind of discrimination. And that's only true if you cherry pick the way you look at statistics. Where that comes from really is this idea that Black people make up 13% of the population, but they account for approximately 26% of police deaths. So therefore, they're overrepresented, right? So that statistic is accurate, but it's misleading because it's basically one of the things I point out in my book, and it's not my original idea. I stole it from Thomas Sowell, but it's this idea that, well,
Good
you
author.
know, yeah, he's a little bit smarter than I am. But like you look at the NBA, right? Is the NBA biased towards Black people because 78% of the NBA is Black and only 13% of the population? No, it's this idea that when you look at the claim I make in my book is that, well, most fouls in the NBA are called on Black people, right?
Hmm.
Well, is that because the refs are racist against Black people? No, it's because almost 80% of the NBA currently is Black. So, of course, most of the fouls are going to be called about Black people. So you can't look at 13%. You have to look at how often are police encountering Black people versus white people or Hispanic people or what have you. And that's just one example. So basically, the idea was I would kind of debunk not only that claim with a deeper look into statistics, but I would also explain why Darren Wilson, for example, was legally justified in using deadly force on Michael Brown, even though Michael Brown did not have a knife or a firearm. And then after George Floyd, in that summer of 2020, the summer of love, uh, where you couldn't have a barbecue with your family of more than 6 people, but you could go out and 20,000 people and riot. That was fine. I decided, at the kind of encouragement of my wife, well, I'm going to write a book about this. And so the book came out in February of 2022, and it did kind of what I just described. It explains police training. It debunks this notion that Blacks are just being indiscriminately killed by police. And it also debunked this idea that the vast majority of these police killings that we hear about in the news are justified, are not justified, because they, with the exception perhaps of George Floyd, and there's a lot of controversy over that case I don't need to get into here, but all the other ones that I mentioned are justified killings, even though they get propped up by, charlatans like Ben Crump and other politicians like our current VP is, these dastardly police killing poor Black people that were just trying to, go about their day. And, you know, the college took exception to that. And once they find out, uh, they had a complaint. Apparently, there was an article written about my book in the Daily Kos, and someone in administration saw the article. The next thing I know, I've got the VP of academic success and a member of HR knocking on my office door, wanting to know, what am I teaching in class? Am I forcing my students to buy my book, which I didn't, and things like this. And they're like, well, you have to be very careful because what you're teaching in class may trigger people. And they were just very, very concerned about what I was
Sensitivity
teaching.
training.
And
Yeah.
yeah. And I'm like, what about this whole thing called academic freedom? It's not like I'm sitting there lying to these kids or only giving them one side of the story. I'm saying, this is what your book says. And I'm explaining why the book is technically correct, but how they're cherry picking information. And here's another way to look at it. And they just
So,
really took umbrage with that.
so do you think you were terminated, shall we say, from your job primarily because of the dissection of these high profile cases, or was it more about teaching uh, your students their rights in the Constitution. Admittedly, I'm not a criminal justice major, so it's a field that I'm interested in, but it's not my
Yeah.
expertise.
No, I think that put the target on my back. They really didn't have a good reason to get rid of me for the book, right? Typically in academia, when a college professor writes a book or gets published in a peer reviewed journal, which I've also done, it's a good thing, right? You know, and at the community college level, the reality is most people that teach at community colleges do not get published. It's not something. It's not like at a university where you're on a tenure track and publishing is expected of you and really required of you. Um, while there are people in community colleges that do get published, it's not something that's required. And really, in my experience, it wasn't even encouraged. It was just like, oh wow, you did it, great. But for me, it was just, oh, well, you shouldn't have written about that kind of thing. But
Hmm.
you know, they didn't have an opportunity. They went ahead and extended my contract. This all happened in March of 22. The way the school operates is if you're not going to be renewed, you have to be informed by March 31st. So I think really what happened was it all happened so close to that deadline, and they didn't really have any kind of real reason to get rid of me. And they thought maybe, well, maybe this will just blow over. Maybe it's not a big deal. Well, fast
But
forward to August.
obviously,
Yeah.
that's not the
Well,
case.
yeah. So in August of 2022, I went to CPAC as a guest of the National Police Association. A colleague saw me post on Facebook a picture of myself with the national spokeswoman, and that I was at CPAC, and then there were some text messages sent that I was a threat to democracy and I needed to be pushed out of the college. And so I kept those text messages. I got pictures of them because I had a feeling I might need them down the road. And then in February of last year, almost a year ago now, I got suspended administratively with pay because a student complained that I was pushing an anti-LGBTQ ideologies in class, which stemmed from a discussion. A student who was a little bit older, in his late 20s, was asking about the changing of political culture, specifically about the pronoun things. Because, you know, when this gentleman was in his late 20s, so when he was in high school, you know, 10, 11 years ago, there was no pronoun. It was, you think this is back in 2013. This is, you know, transgender was not mainstream. It was not something discussed the way it is today. And so for him, he was just trying to get an explanation of how this all happened because he's shocked by it. And I kind of was just going through the more brief history of it. And I just gave some examples of some of the controversies around it about, you know, I talked about, you know, Leah Thomas winning the national championship in girls swimming, despite being William Thomas the year before. I mentioned some other,
Don't
you know,
that name.
yeah, some
I'm
just
not gonna say it.
controversies. And this student, this female student, was like, "Well, you're making a moral judgment." I'm like, "No, I'm just giving you both sides of the story." And I said, if you don't believe me that there are people within the gay community, for example, that don't like the transgender movement, go look at Gays Against Groomers on X. Go look at the story of Chloe Cole. Interestingly enough, when I went to AmFest, I got to meet Chloe Cole and many of the Gays Against Groomers people, and they're wonderful. I had a great time getting to know some of them. But it was just this kind of moment where she made a complaint, and then the college was like, "Aha, now we've got him." They didn't. They fired me before they interviewed me. They had interviewed a one of my other students in that class who had my back and said I did not say anything wrong. I had actually three affidavits, and it was a small class, only 7 students, so it amounted to half the rest of the class. A liberal student who had me before, a black libertarian student, and a Hispanic student who was conservative. So minority kids from all different political views, and they all basically said the same thing. I'm a great professor. I never said anything offensive and never took sides. But yet they had the complaint, and so they fired me before they even interviewed me.
Hmm.
And then at the end of the day, they actually tell me, well, we don't even finish the investigation because the student dropped it on the student complaint side. But after that, it was already gone. And so it really came back to what my friends and I, my colleagues and I figured is I got kind of the the mark. I got marked because of that book, and they were just waiting for a complaint to come through as an excuse to get rid of me.
Very
And
saddening. Yeah, I'm a college student currently, and I worry a lot about academic freedom. So kudos to you for presenting both sides of the argument in a rational way. We need more of that. I wanted to ask you, so you shared this article from Law Enforcement Today about 2 days ago, um, saying that you won a lawsuit. Um, is that accurate?
Yeah. So when all this happened, I was really taken aback. I was very upset. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, and so I thought maybe naively that they said it would take about 2 weeks, and I'd get paid leave. So initially, I was like, okay, this is going to be a 2 week paid vacation, and I was a little upset, but kind of the way I was treated because the police had to escort me from campus as if I was some sort of violent threat to
It
people,
wouldn't
which I found
be.
out later is, yeah, I found out later that they're only supposed to do that when you present a credible threat to the physical
Hmm.
safety of a student or faculty member, which this class was held via Zoom. So I'm not even sure the student ever made it to campus. And in fact, the student never missed class even after the incident in question. So obviously she wasn't afraid of me. But anyways, I got escorted by police under armed guard. And, you know, but a friend of mine at Texas State, a colleague of mine, told me about the Academic Freedom Alliance. And so I contacted them. And initially, they took my case to kind of represent me during this investigation period. And once I was let go, it turned into, okay, we're going to sue. And so, kind of make a long story short, uh, they approved to pay my legal bills up to a certain point, which was far more money than I had. Um, and at the end of the day, we were going to file a federal free speech lawsuit. And Alamo Colleges kind of begged us, "Hey, let's try mediation first." And so we agreed to do mediation, and mediation took about, it was me, my attorney, the mediator, and they had like 8 people on their side. So they like brought out all the big guns. They had the president of the college, all the outside counsel, the lawyers employed by the college. I mean, they brought out the big guns, I guess, in an attempt to intimidate me and my lawyer. Little do they know, I think at the time, that my attorney, his law firm, they specialize in these cases. All they do is academic, and they're Yale and Princeton lawyers. They're
I am
really good at
familiar
what they
with Fire.
do.
They're good people.
No, it wasn't Fire. Well, they've worked with Fire, but it's Academic Freedom Alliance. But this was
Oh,
Michael
okay.
Allen and Sam Harris. The New York Post did a whole story on them because they're kind of the lawyers for the canceled. And the Post story that Ricky Schlott wrote, and you may know Ricky Schlott, she and Greg Lukanoff just wrote the follow up to Coddling of the American Mind. It came out last fall, and it's called The Canceling of the American Mind. She's a young former NYU student who writes for the New York Post now.
No,
And
but
so
I'll
she wrote the
definitely
story.
put it on my book list.
Yeah, it's good. I'm reading it right now. And I actually was one of the articles or one of the stories featured that they, in that story that they were doing on my attorney. So, and then Academic Freedom Alliance was willing to pay well into the 6 figures to defend me. So I guess they thought they were going to intimidate me and try to like just kind of scare me to go away. And at the end of the day, neither we weren't agreeing to their terms, they weren't agreeing to ours. So the mediator said, "Would y'all agree to let me make a proposal?" And so we did. And then a day later, both sides got a copy of the proposal settlement amount and terms. And we had a week to decide. And it wasn't quite as much money as I was hoping for. But at the end of the day, I really, my wife and I we kind of wanted to get it past this, but also I wasn't getting paid anymore, and so I needed to pay my bills. It's your
In
your
this
credit card
economy,
company and your mortgage company is not going to be like, "Oh, sorry that you're in this situation. We'll just let you live in your house, without paying your mortgage," or that kind of thing. So we both accepted it, and the amount was for $185,000. And of course, Uncle Sam's got to take his cut. Uh, and
well,
then
congrats.
Yes, thank you. And that the college, agreed to give me a neutral reference, and I'm just never allowed to work for any of the 5 colleges in that district again, which is fine
Well,
with
I
me.
don't think you'd want to go back there anyways. When
No,
exactly did this go through? Apart
uh,
from the Law Enforcement and Today article, am I the first person to interview you after that?
Um, yeah, in a podcast format, yes. College Fix had written an initial article about me in the summer, and I ran into them in Amfest. They were actually 2 booths down from where I was, so they did a quick follow up. And Campus Reform is working on one right now. But you're my first, like, face to face interview, really.
So let's get some initial reactions. Obviously, you said it's not the amount of money that you wanted, but certainly it sure feels good to win, get that vindication that, you know, they acknowledge they did something wrong. I don't quite know the terms
No,
of the
then
settlement.
yeah, they don't ever acknowledge it anything wrong. But um, you know, there is another professor in the biology department that is suing them. He was an adjunct for them for 20 years, and he got fired for teaching, supposedly teaching religion in the class. He is a pastor. That's apparently his full time gig, but he's a biology professor on the side, and he has been for 20 years. And he had the audacity to teach that double X chromosomes means you're female and XY means you're male. And some students got apparently offended that he was preaching to them, and so he got fired um, in the middle of his, or towards the end of 2022. And so my understanding, I've talked to his attorney with First Liberty. My understanding is that they are actually suing because, he doesn't need the adjunct money. The adjunct money, I guess, was just some, just kind of extra money, whatever. So he has a full-time job that he still has. So he was in a position where he can fight this, which I would have liked to have been in that position because, the thing that, while the money I got was close to the amount that I was hoping for, not quite, but it's definitely put me in a position where, in the short term, I don't have to worry about money, for a while. My wife works full time. I'm still teaching at Texas State. I've got some other kind of opportunities, on the horizon. Um, but the part that upsets me is that the board and the president and the vice president of the colleges, they're not the ones paying this money. It's the taxpayer, right? I mean,
Hmm.
yes, the insurance company that they have paid a bulk of that settlement, but how do they pay the insurance company? With taxpayer dollars. And then about 40% of the settlement was paid to me as wages, which of course that's taxpayer money. And so they're not the ones, hurting from this. And I'm hoping that this other gentleman, Mr. Dr. Varkey, does sue them to the point where it becomes painful for the board to keep defending this. Because, so in my case, U.S. Congressman Chip Roy, who's my congressman, wrote a letter to the president of St. Phillips, kind of wondering, okay, my constituent tells me that you're abridging his free speech. And of course they said, well, we can't comment on any active cases. And then with Varkey, I found out that a letter from not just Chip Roy, but Senator Ted Cruz, Representative Dan Crenshaw, and a couple others got sent to the same president. So this is obviously a pattern that they're dealing with. And this school, Texas now supposedly has laws against DEI offices for the college
Good for
level.
them.
Yeah, but it's all they've done is change the name. University of Texas at Austin, excuse me, at San Antonio, changed their DEI office to, they just renamed it something else, and are kind of trying to, like, skirt the law. St. Phillips and Alamo colleges, as of, a couple months ago when I checked, when the law had already been in effect, still had their DEI pages on their website, their DEI statement, their master teacher program, which are required to go through, requires a DEI statement from the faculty member as a condition of getting your certificate as a master teacher. So I had to write that DEI statement, and I came up with, you know, the bare minimum that would qualify me without kind of violating my principles. It was basically about, what I focused on is realizing there was a lot of kids that come from, their first generation students, maybe their parents never graduated high school, and just focusing on that kind of diversity of background that I would help just understanding where these people come from. And so it counted. But what they really want is, this kind of idea that you're going to treat people with certain backgrounds differently, and which is kind of code for we're going to be easier on them, you know, and try to push this kind of, narrative that somehow they're oppressed, and America's this terribly systemically racist place, which, let's be honest, 70 years ago it definitely was. But I don't think it's been that way since I was born. I think in the vast majority of institutions throughout most of my life have not been systematically oppressive anymore. I think we've passed that. But it's almost like it's, again, Thomas Sowell says, there's just a certain group of people that they would be out of a job if people
If
realized how
racism
fair America has
died,
become. Yeah, and so
yeah,
they
they're
kind of have a
fanning the
stake in
flames
keeping
to kind
it.
of keep it alive.
Yeah, because otherwise they're irrelevant. And
Well,
that's kind of what I think is going on.
I've certainly had to do the thing that you described of using their own language kind of just to get by. On the student side, I definitely notice the suppression of free speech, but you would say that it's epidemic not just to you, but to other uh, folks on the professor side too.
Yeah, it really depends on the administration and how they're going to back you. I will tell you that at Texas State, the culture in the political science department is very different than what I experienced at St. Phillips. We have people in that department who are very progressive, left leaning. We have people that are very conservative. We have people more moderate, and no one seems to think that that is anything other than the way it should be. I've never had a single complaint at Texas State, knock on wood, from students or other faculty. I've got nothing but excellent evaluations from the assistant department chair who's in charge of evaluating all the adjunct instructors. I know that the attorneys for St. Philip's reached out to Texas State to see if I'd ever been disciplined there. And of course, my department chair, who is now my boss, but he was my master's chair when I went through grad school there. Of course, I consider him not just a mentor and a colleague, but a friend. And he's like, no, he's been absolutely, impeccable here at Texas State. And it's funny, you look at
I feel
my
like
rate
they're
my
trying to find dirt on you or something.
Yeah, and I mean, if you go to my rate my professor at Texas State, I think one person really didn't like me, but the other 30 or so reviews that people have written were pretty stellar. And I think that's just the way I teach. Yes, personally, I am very conservative, but I don't preach to people. I just give them the information, challenge them to think, and at the end of the day, if after my class is over they are conservative minded, great. If they're progressive but they know why they're progressive and they have thought through their perspective and can defend it, great. They learned how to think. That's my job. My job isn't to sit up there and to indoctrinate a bunch of people. Some of the students that have been not only my favorite but I've been their favorite have actually been pretty progressive. uh, when I taught college courses, the high school level and the dual credit program for years, and I've kept in touch with quite a few of those students, and some of them that, again, have liked me the most have been the ones that politically were the most opposite, because it's about treating people with respect and just being a good person, and
Yeah,
and
that's
I.
something, that from the 80s, like Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan. I always try to bring that in my feelings as a turning point president of treating the other side with dignity. I found that, as I've grown, the left, as what we call the left, demands sort of a monolith of like if you have to
Mhm.
agree with 100% of everything, whereas there's sort of a growing, I call it the freedom faction, so does Tim Pool, of disaffected liberals and people who, they don't agree on everything, but they certainly can get along and they encourage that diversity of thought.
Yeah, and I would hope that the right avoids that trap. Unfortunately, I see signs that the right is kind of falling into that as well. Especially, you see that a lot, I think, on X, um, where people just,
Demanding a monolith.
yeah, I mean, on the right, I mean, I guess you see this with the election. You'll have people that if you're not like a 100% Trump supporter, somehow you're a rhino. Or I mean, you take my congressman Chip Roy. He's consistently ranked as one of the most, if not the most conservative representative in the entire House of Representatives, but he's backing DeSantis, and so therefore he's disloyal to Trump. Therefore, he's a rhino. I know a lot of people have that mindset, and I'm like, guys, you're in my opinion, you may disagree with me, and that's fine. In my opinion, it's like you're kind of acting like the left. Like if you're not 100% in line with, then you're somehow the bad guy. And we can disagree on who the best candidate for the Republican Party is in 24. I think there's a handful of them that are pretty good candidates. I think even the ones I think are pretty bad candidates would be better than Biden, but that's not really saying much.
Dan Sandwich would be better than Biden.
Yeah, I mean, but I think I don't want to turn into the left where it has to be this monolith. And but I think you're right. If you look at the left, you look at people like Bill Maher, you know, who I've been watching since I was in college when he had that show Politically Incorrect. Now he's at Real Time on HBO. He hasn't changed since I was in my 20s. And yet now he's considered almost right wing by a lot of people because he just isn't bat crazy.
Yeah, there's
You know,
Elon Musk, when he took over Twitter, now X, did post that meme. I'll put it on screen right here for my viewers, but I'll just describe it to you. It's three lanes. It's like a left and a right spectrum, a left, a right, and then the left is like running, and it's like my fellow liberal question mark. And then there's a person in the middle is now on the right because the left has gone so far left.
yeah. I remember that. I was actually just thinking that's really what's happened to a lot of people like Elon or a Bill Maher or, a lot of these people because
Me
they're not. What's that?
or me.
Oh yeah. I mean, and it's kind of funny, for somebody of my age. I mean, I'm 45, and to view these people that historically they were the liberal left, and now they're almost considered right wing by a lot of the younger liberals or younger leftists, and it's ridiculous. But that's kind of, and I just don't want to see the right kind of fall into that trap because it can be. It's easier to it's it's easier to fall into it than you might think. My undergrad was in psychology, and so that group think, we're on the right, we're susceptible to that too. If you read the coddling of the American mind or the canceling of the American mind, most of their attacks, the examples they use of people that are kind of perpetuating this stuff are on the left, but there are some on the right as well. And I think we just kind of have to watch ourselves to a certain extent. I think for the most part, we do a really good job of that. But I'm a precinct chair in Comal County, which is a pretty good sized county, a very red county in Texas.
Mm.
And I see that sometimes with some of the people I associate with at the county level, who it's like the way I put it now, I voted for Trump twice. I've been a fan of Trump since the 80s when I used to watch WWF wrestling, Hulk Hogan and all that, and Trump was involved with that. So I've known of the man. I've been a fan of his outside of politics for at least 30 years, if not longer. If he's the nominee this year, I'll vote for him again. But there are people that I run into that it's almost like, here's Trump and here's the U.S. Constitution. Like their loyalty is more to him than it is to the U.S. Constitution. And not to say all Trump supporters, and I would say probably the majority of them are not that way. I'm not, but I've run into people that are kind of like that. And I'm like guys, conservatives, we're supposed to conserve the principles of the Constitution and the founding era. That's why we're called conservatives. That's what should be our number one priority, not an individual, because love him or hate him, Trump's only got 4 years left if he wins. If he loses, he's probably going to be two. You know what I mean? If he loses in 24, it's unlikely he'll run in 28 because he'll be 80.
Yeah, he'll
whatever.
Be too old.
So we got to play the long game here. Trump's got, at best case scenario, Trump's got 4 years. We got to play the long game and remember that we should be a party of principles. And I don't think supporting Trump violates any of those principles by any means. His policies were very conservative. My point being is that our loyalty, in my opinion, has got to be to the Constitution, not to a person. if that makes
100%
sense.
agree. Yeah, no, I think that a lot of people would benefit from reading those documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers. Reading in general, I've made a habit of reading before I go to bed. Personally, I'm a huge Vivek fan. I think Mr.
I am too. I like
Ramaswamy
him a
runs a
lot.
good campaign. I'd be happy with either one of them. And this, for legal purposes, this is me as an individual, not representing anything. I did want to ask you, what advice do you have, for you, first, how did you get through all of those legal troubles with the First Amendment? But what advice would you have for someone who feels afraid to speak their mind? Uh, and what words of wisdom would you give them?
Well, what got me through, number one thing is, just having faith in God that I've been through tough times before. This isn't the end of the world. Um, just kind of having faith that one way or the other, I'm going to fall down. He'll help me up, and that kind of thing. My
Amen.
wife was a big, yeah, my wife was a big support. For me, always kind of, because I would get down. My 5 days before I got fired, my father passed. So it was a pretty rough
I'm sorry for your loss.
period. Yeah, thank you for personally and professionally, and it's I had some job interviews where a couple of them where the college didn't care what was going on. I had one that once they found out what happened to me, they canceled the interview. So there's just kind of like not knowing what's going to happen in the future. Um, but again, I had faith in God, and my wife had faith in me, which was very important because sometimes I got down on myself. But at the end of the day, for someone who's in a situation where they feel they can't speak up, I would just remind you that the law is on our side, and that we can't just let other people do our fighting for us. I know it's hard when you're younger and you may not be afraid to speak up. You may be afraid to speak up because you're the only lone voice. But I will tell you that as Ronald Reagan would say, that there's nowhere else to go. We're the city on a hill. If America fails, where do we go? If America becomes a fascist or totalitarian state, or even not necessarily to that evil level, but that soft tyranny, the soft despotism that Alexis de Tocqueville
Crony
warns us about.
capitalism?
Yeah, but if you've ever read Democracy in America, if you haven't, that's like the most seminal
Put
political
that on
science
my
book.
list too.
Um, where Alexis de Tocqueville in 1835 predicts where we are today, because he says there's things that are going to keep America. America is basically, I'll give you the very, very short Cliff's Notes version. He said America is obsessed with equality, and if they continue down that path, it's going to be a point where they're going to give the government so much control that they'll be like a soft tyranny, like a benevolent master, you know, like a nanny that takes care of all of us, but we have no freedom left. So not like a Kim Jong Un or a Joseph Stalin type of system, but a system where the government basically takes care, a nanny state. He says what's going to prevent us from that is our associations with our fellow person. We don't really have a lot of that anymore. Federalism, but the biggest thing is religion.
Hmm.
And all three of those buffers that would prevent us from turning into this are have been whittled away. And so we're seeing kind of 170 years later, or 100, I guess 190 years later now, what he had kind of predicted. If we allow what makes us unique to go by the wayside, we're just going to turn into another, just like anyone else. But I will tell you that for you as a student, just know that there are organizations out there, not just FIRE, not just Alliance Defending Freedom, but now Academic Freedom Alliance. There are people out there that will support you, that will defend you, and so you really don't have anything really to lose in the long run, except your country, right? So be bold, fight like hell. Even if you're the only person, just know that you are in the right, because I'm a son of the American Revolution. I have 6 ancestors that fought in the militias against the most powerful army and navy on the earth at the time. the way I look at it, if they were willing to risk their lives and their families and their fortunes, I can risk a little money, a little public shame, you know. Um, just know that there are organizations that will back you up, right? If you get in trouble with your school, if you get expelled, if you get an F because you wrote a book, wrote a report that the professor didn't like, there are organizations out there now that will pay for your legal defense, and take care of it. There's Turning Point, there's Young Americans for Freedom, and then there's these groups that we mentioned that will actually pay to defend you. So just be bold, and you know, I don't know how to. It just is. I know it sounds so
No,
simple, and I know
that's
it's not. I know
inspiring.
it's not quite that simple, because you are nervous, especially when you're. I don't know how old you are, but when I was 18, 19 in these
21.
big classes, okay, yeah, when I was about 18, 19 in these big classes, I had a hard time speaking out sometimes until I was a junior or senior. Then I was a little bit more brazen. But you know, the thing that got me to the point where I refused to back down is having been a police officer. Because
Mm.
whenever I'm like nervous, I'm like, dude, I ran toward gunfire. If I can run towards gunfire, I can stand up to this little prick who's who's trying to push me around because they think they can intimidate me with holding my job over me or whatever. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. And I know not everybody, it's something you kind of have to learn to do. Not everybody has that instinct. I didn't necessarily have it. It had to be developed in me, but um, just pray, know that, you know, God's on your side, because I think God wants us to be free. The founders believe that. The founders believe that Christianity was the most favorable religion to liberty. In fact, it was partly necessary for liberty. So just, be bold and go for it. And if you need help, there's organizations that will help you.
Well, I mean, I also consider myself a son of the American Revolution. I don't have the exact genealogy going that far back, but certainly the ideas. And also, fun fact, I share the birthday with the same day the Battle of Yorktown was won, and they won the
Oh,
American
awesome.
Revolution. That would be October 19th. So,
Very cool.
I is there any other things you want to talk about before we start wrapping things up?
Um, just as a little bit of advice from our guy, I'm assuming a lot of your listeners probably are in college, or you're that age group. Uh, I think one of the mistakes that conservatives in general have made is kind of staying out of the culture wars. And the culture wars, I think some groups are doing a really good job. The Daily Wire, regardless of what you think of Ben Shapiro and all them, the fact that they're providing alternative programming for kids, the fact that they're making movies and TV shows now, and they have, Jeremy's chocolates and Jeremy's razors. Yeah, I know it's just making him a lot of money.
I got Jeremy's
And
razors for Christmas. It's a good brand.
yeah, but my point is that they recognize that we far too long, conservatives just kind of allowed the left to take over academia, take over Hollywood, the media, and now they're taking over K through 12 education, and those are the areas that we've got to be willing to fight in those battlegrounds. And I think the media is doing is well, because with the internet and podcasting, talk radio, all these different news organizations that are they're conservative, that's great. I think that's going to help. But I mean, just the idea of making entertainment products and then going into academia. If you're a conservative and you enjoy teaching or researching and things, go into academia. It's going to be tough, but fight. If you don't want to, be a professor or something like that, or even like a high school teacher, get involved with this school board. Run for school board. Now that my wife, she's a teacher and where I live, and she actually moved districts, so she teaches in a neighboring town now. So now I can actually run for school board. Where I live, the next election I think is in 26, and I fully plan to run for school board. They preclude you from running if your immediate family is an employee of the district. That's why I couldn't do it until she left. But I fully plan to do that because you know that's what the vast majority of Americans can't can't homeschool. So, we got to put our kids into our local public school, and we got to know what's going on in there. And it's not like they're necessarily that they're being, all these places, are going to be really obvious with their indoctrination, but we should know what's going on in the classroom. We should know, when we walk into an English class, what books are on the shelf for kids to choose from. And I'm not saying we should be banning all books or anything like that, but there is an idea of age appropriateness. And I think if you're going to have, um, in my local middle school, Ibram Kendi's Stamped, right? The pseudo history book that I've read through.
I'm
And
all too familiar with that.
yeah, I've read the Stamped for Kids, which was modified from his original book by Jason Reynolds, I think, or something. I was
Start from
reading
the
through that.
beginning, I believe.
Yeah, and there's a kids version, and I was in this local middle school, and I sat down because I was substitute teaching to kind of help out during COVID, and I read through that. I was just like, oh my gosh, this is such bullshit. Sorry, and I'm
No
thinking,
worries.
and I'm like, but if a kid picks this up, how are they going to know any different? So if they're going to have that book, they better well have Rush Limbaugh's history books for kids, or something to kind of balance it. Um, but that's the kind of thing that I think parents, far too long, conservatives have just kind of like let the culture wars, up to the left. And if we don't start fighting back, I mean, at some point, it's going to be insurmountable, right? Because I mean, as Andrew Breitbart said, politics is just downhill from
Tilted
culture,
downstream from culture.
from
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean,
downstream.
I certainly noticed that a while ago, and part of the ethos of my show is, primarily a culture show, but where politics isn't a taboo. If someone wants to ask me what I believe, I'll tell them honestly. But
Yeah.
I often think about how to tell good stories and embrace goodness. Do you have any word on that?
Well, I think it's important. Our history with literature, there's just amazing stories out there that teach a lot of good values, and the classics. And I think a lot of times, the classics, well, they are written by a bunch of old white men, or whatever. But the the philosophical values that they inculcate in kids is very, very important. And this is something, I think telling good stories to kids, and teaching them those classics is important. And even more in modern America, one of the things that, for me, that frustrates me, I grew up a comic book nerd. Like, you can go in my closet, and I've got like these huge boxes full of comic books. You know, I don't know how many I have. It's embarrassing probably to say, but I grew up reading all of those comic books. And I remember getting made fun of because I was still in high school and college reading comic books, right? Superman and Spider-Man, and Spider-Man was my favorite, whatever. And now it's like this big, huge thing with Disney. And what are they starting to do? They're starting to change a lot of these characters to fit some sort of modern idea of politics, to make them woke, or to make, and I don't care if you want to make a character, make a new character, but these particular stories had value, because when you look at a character like Superman, truth, justice, and the American way, they don't even use that anymore. They've taken out the American way part, right? You look at a character like Captain America or Spider-Man, those characters taught certain values that are very necessary and very important. And if you lose that, if what's Spider-Man's most famous line?
With great power comes great responsibility.
Right. And it's been in all movies, but at a certain point, if you lose that and you start focusing on, well, who's Spider-Man sleeping with, or you're more concerned about, is Spider-Man non-binary, black, or, what, I don't really care. The point is that those values are what made those characters last as long as they have, right? Because they're timeless. And so I think you're seeing that with Disney in this new phase. They're focusing on the wrong things instead of wanting to tell good stories that people can relate to, that really touches their heartstrings, or teaches valuable lessons, and presents characters you can look up to. They're focusing on all this other stuff, and unfortunately, you know that's going to have an effect on the kids that do watch it. So, I think it's very important to teach our kids uh, stories that are they're gonna pass on certain values to them. And I think that's something that America traditionally did in schools. People may say, separation of church and state and all that, but believe it or not, the Bible was taught in public school, taxpayer funded public schools into the 20th century, because it wasn't necessarily about teaching you to be Christian or a certain type of Christian. It was about teaching you certain values that America thought were important, that the government thought was important to pass on to citizens. And we've kind of lost that. So I think anytime you can do that in a public forum, in education with your own kids or in a podcast like this, I think is a very valuable tool.
Well, I certainly hope to bring all of that to the table. A personal casualty for me with the whole Disney stuff is, Doctor Who is closer now to Doctor Woke, and I'm not a fan of it. Um, I talk about wordsmithing as my ikigai, as my calling, a combination of seeking the truth through investigative journalism and what have you, and telling good stories. Now, as this final question, I'll ask you, what is your calling?
I would say to serve. Um, Pretty much I knew early on in life I wasn't going to be rich. Nothing I was interested in really made a lot of money. And I was never like this ultra focused alpha type guy who had to be, I was ultra competitive in sports and things, but I was never this kind of person. Like I see these shows where people work 90 hours a week to get ahead so they get their name on the door and stuff like that. Was never going to be me. I've been in youth ministry. I've been a teacher. I've been a police officer. I feel like even though now I'm at the height, of teaching, which at the college level, that's still an active service to me. And so I think my calling has just always been to serve other people, to give myself to them, whether it be teaching religious ed on Sunday nights at my local church, or just, you know, being someone that a student who's having trouble and needs advice can come to and talk to me, not just about politics, but about what they should major in, what they should do in life, what type of person should they marry, those kinds of things. That's just something that I just feel like I've always been called to help and to serve people.
That's such a beautiful calling. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Brewster call. I will
Thank you
definitely
for
keep
having
up
me.
with you, and good luck with everything you'll do. I pray for you, and yeah, happy to have you on here.
Oh, I appreciate it. It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
If you like this sort of content and want to see more, make sure to spread the calling, subscribe, or support me on thebrewstercall.locals.com.